My name is Reese Calloway, nurse at Franklin Memorial Hospital. When the first blizzard hit in August, none of us knew we were witnessing the beginning of an Ice Age apocalypse. For 30 days, I watched our hospital transform from a place of healing to a fortress of survival as temperatures plummeted and civilization crumbled around us. This is how I survived when the world froze over. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I should have known something was wrong when we admitted 3 cases of hypothermia in mid-July. One was a hiker who fell asleep at a campsite and woke up covered in frost. The other 2 were teenagers swimming at Lucky Peak Reservoir who developed symptoms despite it being nearly 80 degrees that day. As the nurse who treated them, I remember thinking it was strange, but chalked it up to a weird weather anomaly. Just a cold snap, we told ourselves. Idaho weather can be unpredictable after all. My name is Reese Calloway. I've been an emergency room nurse at Franklin Memorial Hospital in Boise for 8 years. I specialized in trauma care and disaster response, though nothing in my training prepared me for what was coming. None of us could have been prepared for it. The weird weather continued through July. We had unseasonable rain, then hail, then 3 days of fog so thick you couldn't see across the parking lot. The skies stayed this eerie grayish color that never quite cleared. We joked about it being permanent Seattle weather moving inland. Some of the older staff complained about joint pain from the pressure changes. Dr. Patel, our chief of emergency medicine, mentioned that her gardening club was concerned because plants weren't growing right with the reduced sunlight. There were reports on the news about volcanic activity across the Pacific Ring of Fire. Not just one volcano, but simultaneous eruptions in Japan, the Philippines, Alaska, and Chile. The scientific community was baffled by the coordination of it all. Some atmospheric scientists were raising alarms about particulate levels in the upper atmosphere, but most media outlets dismissed them as alarmist. After all, we'd had volcanic winters predicted before, and they never amounted to much. The wildlife authorities noted strange migration patterns. Birds flying south 2 months early. Deer and elk moving down from the mountains in large numbers. A pack of wolves was spotted just outside the Boise city limits, something that hadn't happened in decades. These were all warning signs, but humans are good at ignoring warnings until the disaster is already upon us. I remember exactly where I was when the first blizzard hit, August 17th. I was finishing my charting at the nurse's station, getting ready to hand off to the night shift. Megan, another nurse, called out, "Hey, it's that snow." We all laughed, thinking she was joking. But when we looked out the windows, fat white flakes were indeed falling from the sky. In August, in Idaho. Within 2 hours, the temperature had dropped nearly 40 degrees. What began as a curiosity quickly became concerning. My relief nurse called to say her car had slid off the road trying to get to the hospital. That was the beginning of what became a 3-week shift for me and many of my colleagues. The emergency room filled up almost immediately. First came the car accidents as people unused to winter driving conditions in August skidded on rapidly freezing roads. Then came the exposure cases. A family was brought in wearing shorts and t-shirts, their skin blue white with frostbite. They'd been at a lake when the temperature dropped. The father kept repeating, "It's August, this isn't possible." But it was happening, whether we could believe it or not. By midnight, the hospital administration had called an emergency meeting. We opened additional wards that had been closed for renovation. Off-duty staff who could make it in were called back. The power flickered several times that first night as the electrical grid strained under the sudden demand for heating. The hospital generators kicked in momentarily, then the main power would return. The National Guard was mobilized to help with traffic accidents and stranded motorists. They brought the more serious cases to us. Many people had been caught completely unprepared. Tourists in summer clothing, homeless individuals without shelter, elderly people in homes without adequate heating. The morgue received its first cold-related fatality at 4 in the morning on that first day. A homeless man found frozen on a bench downtown. He wouldn't be the last. By day 3, the hospital had been designated as an official emergency shelter. The governor appeared on television declaring a temporary climate anomaly and assured everyone that federal assistance was on the way. The snow had not stopped falling. Roads were becoming increasingly difficult to clear. People who had made it to the hospital were unable to leave, and our facility was already over capacity. We began rationing food in the cafeteria, limiting portions and prioritizing patients and essential staff. We converted conference rooms and offices into sleeping quarters. Privacy became a luxury no one could afford. I hadn't been home in 3 days, and my scrubs were starting to smell despite my best efforts to wash them in the staff bathroom sink. Dr. Patel pulled me aside during a rare quiet moment on day 5. She was usually the calmest person in any crisis, but I could see fear in her eyes. "Reese," she said quietly, "make sure your family has warm clothes and at least 2 weeks of food. This isn't going to be temporary." That same day, the mayor appeared on local television, claiming the weather would pass within a week. Behind him stood 2 scientific advisors from Boise State University. I'll never forget the look they exchanged as the mayor spoke, a look that told me everything I needed to know. No one understood what was happening, and no one knew when it would end. The hospital transformed into something more than a medical facility during those first days. We became a fortress against the cold, a community hub, and for many, the only hope for survival. The administration cleared out the physical therapy department and moved in cots. It became a dormitory for families with nowhere else to go. The hospital wasn't designed to be a home for hundreds, but we had what everyone suddenly needed most: heat and food. From the windows on the 10th floor, I watched boys disappear. Buildings became white lumps. Cars abandoned in streets formed eerie shapes under growing snowdrifts. People stopped trying to clear paths because there was nowhere to go anyway. The snow kept falling day after day, and the temperature kept dropping. By day 6, we had organized a complete inventory of hospital supplies. Non-essential spaces were converted to storage. The first truly difficult decisions about resource allocation were made. Who got the extra blankets? Which areas of the hospital would maintain full heating? And which would be allowed to cool to conserve fuel? The hospital board implemented emergency protocols, but the traditional command structure was already breaking down as the situation moved beyond anything our policies had anticipated. The head of maintenance, a practical man named Jim who'd worked at Franklin Memorial for over 20 years, presented a sobering assessment to the senior staff. Our generator capacity was robust, designed to keep critical systems running during regional power outages. But our fuel reserves were another matter. If the main power grid failed completely, we had perhaps 2 weeks of fuel at current usage rates, and that assumed we could keep the fuel itself from gelling in the extreme cold. This information wasn't shared widely. Dr. Harris from administration created a spreadsheet projecting how long we could last under various scenarios. When he showed me the numbers, his hands were shaking. "Don't share this with the others," he said. "Not yet. But rumors spread in a hospital, no matter how careful you are." The fear was palpable. On day 9, the National Guard arrived in force. 3 transport helicopters landed on our rooftop helipad, bringing some supplies before such flights became impossible due to the weather. They established a security perimeter around the hospital and implemented controlled entry protocols. With their help, we retrieved additional supplies from neighboring pharmacies and medical offices. The soldiers looked so young, many of them barely out of high school. Their lieutenant kept apologizing that they couldn't bring more supplies. "We're securing every hospital in a 200-mile radius," he told me during a brief conversation while unloading medical supplies. "But there's too many people and not enough of everything." The weariness in his eyes spoke volumes about what they'd already seen in the city. The first conflicts with desperate civilians seeking shelter occurred that same day. A group of about 30 people attempted to force their way in through the emergency entrance. The National Guard troops stopped them, but not before 2 soldiers and a security guard were injured. After that, more troops were stationed at every entrance, and the hospital windows on the ground floor were reinforced with whatever materials we could find. By day 11, communication systems were failing one by one. Cell service became increasingly spotty as towers lost power or were damaged by ice. The internet worked intermittently, allowing brief contact with the outside world before failing again. People crowded around the few working phones in the hospital, waiting for their turn to make what might be their last call to loved ones. I managed to reach my sister in Tucson. The situation there was better, no snow, but unusually cold temperatures and food shortages as the supply chain collapsed. I asked her to check on my apartment if she could, to bring in my cat if she was still alive. We both knew it was unlikely she'd ever make it to Boise, but the pretense gave us comfort. The final television broadcasts we received showed the extent of the national crisis. Weather maps displayed rapidly forming ice sheets across the northern states. Canada had apparently gone completely dark. No communications from any major city for days. The meteorologist finally said what we'd all been fearing. This is consistent with the onset of a rapid ice age. Then the station switched to emergency broadcast signals, and an hour later to static. Day 12 brought a new level of isolation. The hospital's satellite phone became our only reliable link to the outside world, and it was reserved for emergency communications with whatever government authorities remained functional. The rest of us were left to wonder about the fate of the wider world as we focused on the immediate challenges of survival. With each passing day, new medical challenges emerged. Frostbite and hypothermia remained common, but we also began seeing unusual respiratory infections. The pattern was distinct, beginning with a dry cough, progressing to difficulty breathing, and in severe cases, a bluish tinge to the skin that wasn't associated with cold exposure. Our infectious disease specialist, Dr. Levine, collected samples but had limited capacity to analyze them with our dwindling resources. We adapted medical procedures to our limited supplies. IVs had to be warmed before administration to prevent further cooling of already hypothermic patients. Medications were becoming scarce, particularly antibiotics. We began rationing them strictly, using them only for the most severe infections. The elderly and those with pre-existing conditions were the first to succumb to the combination of cold, stress, and illness. The psychological toll mounted for both patients and staff. Many people were separated from family members and had no way of knowing if their loved ones were alive. Others had witnessed traumatic deaths or had been forced to abandon their homes with no warning. Sleep deprivation and constant stress affected everyone's judgment. Some of my colleagues broke down crying in supply closets or stairwells, taking a few minutes to release their emotions before returning to work with red-rimmed eyes. We held a meeting in the cafeteria on day 14. Everyone who could physically attend came: medical staff, patients who were mobile, families who had sought shelter with us. We weren't just a hospital staff anymore, we were becoming a community of survivors. People volunteered skills I never knew they had: a janitor who'd been a carpenter in his previous career, a patient's daughter who knew how to repair generators, a cafeteria worker who had experience with large-scale food preservation. That meeting established a new governance structure, with committees for food, shelter, security, and medical care. Work rotations were implemented for all able-bodied people. Those who couldn't perform physical tasks taught classes for the children or provided emotional support to others. The pediatric ward was transformed into a school during daylight hours, with doctors, nurses, and patients with teaching experience taking turns providing education and distraction for the youngest survivors. By day 16, the mystery respiratory illness had spread enough to become a serious concern. The lab technicians, working with limited equipment and no external consultation, identified it as a fungal strain typically found in permafrost soils. The leading theory was that the ecological disruption had awakened something dormant for thousands of years. We named it frost lung, and it spread quickly in our overcrowded conditions. The irony wasn't lost on us. As the outside world froze, we were fighting to keep our internal environment from becoming too warm and humid, conditions that promoted fungal growth. But lowering the temperature inside the hospital wasn't an option either. We established isolation protocols and improvised face masks from available materials, but containing the spread was nearly impossible. On day 17, I treated a 7-year-old boy with advanced frost lung. His breathing was labored, and the characteristic blue tinge had spread across his face. We had no effective antifungal medications left, and his small body was losing the battle. His mother, a single parent, hadn't left his side in 3 days. As I adjusted his oxygen flow, one of our last tanks, she asked me if he was going to die. The truth stuck in my throat, but she saw it in my eyes. She nodded once, then turned back to her son and began singing softly to him. He passed away 2 hours later, the fungal growth having completely compromised his lungs. That night, I added his small body to the makeshift morgue we'd established in the hospital's loading dock, now cold enough to serve the purpose without refrigeration. Infrastructure problems began to compound our medical challenges by day 18. The maintenance team reported that several pipes had frozen and burst in the north wing, despite efforts to keep the building's heating system operational. We had to evacuate patients from those rooms and further consolidate people into the central areas of the hospital. The physical proximity increased tensions among an already stressed population and likely contributed to the faster spread of frost lung. The maintenance chief gathered key staff on day 19. His report was grim but delivered with the straightforward pragmatism that had become essential to survival. "We have 3 days of fuel left at current usage," he said. "After that, we can't guarantee heat in all sections." The temperature outside had dropped to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Without heat, the hospital would become a tomb within hours. It was during this meeting that they arrived. 5 figures entered the conference room, bundled in what looked like spacesuits constructed from insulation material. They removed their makeshift helmets, revealing themselves to be 3 professors and 2 students from Boise State University's engineering department. Their leader, Dr. Lancaster, explained they had converted their building systems to run on minimal power generated from modified solar panels. Despite the reduced sunlight, they had developed a way to maximize energy collection and storage. Their building was stable, defendable, and most importantly, sustainable in a way our hospital could never be. They had established a small community of about 50 people, but lacked medical expertise. They needed doctors and nurses, and they were offering hope. The proposal split our already strained hospital leadership. The chief administrator, Barbara Winters, insisted our duty was to our patients and the facility. "We've been entrusted with the care of these people," she said. "We can't abandon them for a theoretical haven that may not be any better." But many of the medical staff saw the Boise State option as our only chance for long-term survival. Dr. Patel, who had warned me days earlier about the severity of our situation, spoke in favor of sending at least some medical personnel with the engineering group. "If we all stay, we may all die," she argued. "If some of us go, establish a secondary location, we increase the chances that medical knowledge survives. This isn't abandonment, it's diversification of resources." No final decision was made that day. The engineers left with a promise to return in 48 hours for an answer, leaving behind detailed maps of the route between the hospital and their facility. Those of us who had seen the projections for our fuel supplies knew that 48 hours might be too long to wait. The next day, day 20, brought a fresh crisis. The temperature inside the hospital's outer rooms dropped below freezing despite our efforts to maintain heating. We consolidated everyone into the central wards, creating conditions that were crowded but survivable. I found myself sharing a narrow hospital bed with 2 other nurses and a pediatric patient. Our breath froze on the blankets, forming tiny crystals that glistened in the emergency lighting. The windows had ice on the inside that grew thicker each hour. We stopped trying to melt it. The hospital director called a meeting in the boardroom, which was lit by alcohol lamps created from medical supplies. She maintained that our duty was to our patients, to stay until the end. Dr. Mendez, whose family in Portland had been unreachable for over a week, argued passionately that our duty was to survive so we could help rebuild. "What good are we to anyone if we're all dead?" he demanded. For the first time, I saw colleagues, friends, screaming at each other as the stress and fear broke through our professional veneers. I sat silently, thinking about the 7-year-old boy I'd watched die from frost lung, about the dwindling supplies, about the engineer's offer. My thoughts were interrupted when one of the lab technicians burst into the room. Dr. Levine, our infectious disease specialist, had developed symptoms of frost lung. As one of the few people actively studying the fungus, her loss would be devastating to our efforts to understand and combat the disease. By day 22, frost lung was spreading rapidly through the shelter. We created an isolation ward in what had been the maternity unit, but it was too late to contain the outbreak. The fungus thrived in the cold, damp conditions we were now living in. With our diminished resources, treatment was mostly supportive, keeping patients comfortable and helping them breathe as long as possible. I watched a young mother sing to her 6-year-old son as he struggled for breath. There were no ventilators left, no more oxygen tanks, just comfort measures and the terrible knowledge that we were losing a battle against something we barely understood. The boy's father had gone to find medicine 3 days earlier and never returned. As the child's breathing slowed and eventually stopped, I wondered if the father was still out there somewhere in the frozen city, or if he too had already succumbed to the cold. The emotional toll was immense. Many staff had been working continuously since the first blizzard hit. Sleep deprivation combined with grief and fear pushed people to their breaking points. A nurse who had been with the hospital for 20 years simply walked out into the snow one night and didn't return. A doctor from neurology barricaded himself in a supply closet, consuming a lethal dose of sedatives. Those of us who remained tried to support each other, but we were all running on empty. Food became an increasingly serious concern. The cafeteria staffs stretched supplies with creative but unappetizing combinations. Portion sizes shrank daily. Children received priority, followed by those performing essential functions. Some adults voluntarily reduced their rations to ensure others had enough. Hunger became a constant companion, gnawing at our concentration and resolve. Water was another challenge. As pipes continued to freeze and burst, liquid water became scarce. We melted snow from the roof, but the process was labor-intensive and required precious fuel. Personal hygiene became a luxury rather than a routine. The smell of unwashed bodies mixed with antiseptic and illness created a distinctive odor that permeated every corner of the hospital. On day 24, the moment we had been dreading arrived. I was in the ICU, checking on a patient with both severe frostbite and early-stage frost lung, when the lights flickered and died. The backup systems should have kicked in immediately, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the sudden wail of disconnected life support equipment. The maintenance team had prepared us for this moment, but practice drills were nothing compared to the real thing. I fumbled for the emergency flashlight I kept in my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. In its weak beam, I could see the panic on my patient's face. I spoke calmly, assuring him we had procedures for this, while mentally running through the steps we needed to take. Manual ventilation for patients on respirators. Chemical heat packs for those at risk of hypothermia. Movement of critical care patients to the central ward, where body heat from the crowd might help maintain survivable temperatures. The next hours were chaos barely controlled by professional training and human determination. We evacuated the ICU patients, carrying them down dark stairwells since the elevators were non-functional. Some didn't survive the move. Others deteriorated rapidly once removed from their supporting equipment. We did what we could with manual techniques, but it wasn't enough for many. The cold invaded the building with frightening speed once the heating systems failed completely. Within hours, the temperature in most areas had dropped below 50 degrees. By morning, it was barely above freezing even in the central wards, where hundreds of people huddled together. People tore curtains from windows to use as extra blankets. Others wore every piece of clothing they owned, looking like misshapen bundles rather than human beings. On day 25, the breaking point came. Dr. Liu, one of our most respected surgeons, had an emotional breakdown during rounds. She collapsed in tears, unable to continue pretending we were providing medical care rather than merely witnessing a slow-motion catastrophe. Others tried to comfort her, but her distress was contagious, spreading through the staff like another epidemic. That same afternoon, the east wing collapsed under the weight of ice and snow that had accumulated on the roof. The sound was like the world ending, a sustained groaning crash that seemed to go on forever. 3 patients and Dr. Wilson, who had gone to retrieve medical supplies, died instantly. Others were injured by falling debris. The collapse destroyed any remaining illusion that the hospital could protect us. That's when I knew staying wasn't noble or dutiful. It was suicide. A small group of us gathered in the staff lounge, doctors and nurses who had been working closely together throughout the crisis. Without directly saying it, we all reached the same conclusion. We would accept the engineers' offer and attempt to reach the university facility. The engineers had promised to return for our answer, but with communications down, we had no way of knowing if they would make it back through the increasingly hostile environment. We decided not to wait. 6 of us would leave at first light the next morning, myself, Dr. Patel, Dr. Mendez, and 3 other nurses who had experience with emergency medicine and cold weather conditions. We would attempt to reach Boy State, and if successful, send back help for those who remained. Telling our colleagues was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Some understood and wished us luck. Others called us traitors and cowards. Barbara Winters, the hospital administrator, threatened to have the National Guard prevent our departure, claiming we were abandoning our posts. But the young lieutenant in charge of the Guard detachment took me aside after the confrontation. "My orders are to protect this facility and its occupants," he said quietly. "But I can't force medical personnel to stay if they believe they can better serve elsewhere. We'll open the perimeter for you at dawn." His eyes, sunken with exhaustion, held a glimmer of hope. "If you make it, send help if you can." We spent that night gathering what supplies we could justify taking, minimal personal items, essential medicines that wouldn't be immediately needed at the hospital, and documentation of what we'd learned about Frost's lung. I wrote detailed instructions for continuing care of my patients and left them with the nurses who would be staying. It felt like abandoning family, and in many ways it was. These people had become more than colleagues during our shared ordeal. We left before dawn on day 26, if you could call it dawn anymore. The sky was perpetually dark gray without distinct day or night. Our group consisted of 2 doctors, 3 nurses including myself, and a respiratory therapist who had extensive mountaineering experience. We wrapped ourselves in hospital blankets over every piece of clothing we owned and carried backpacks with our meager supplies. The journey through frozen boys was like traversing an alien planet. Familiar landmarks were unrecognizable under mountains of snow and ice. The cold was so intense it burned any exposed skin within seconds. We moved as quickly as we could, which wasn't very fast given the depth of the snow and our exhausted state. The city was eerily silent. No traffic sounds, no planes overhead, no human voices except our own muffled communications. Occasionally we heard cracking sounds as buildings stressed beyond their design limits adjusted to the weight of ice or the contraction of freezing materials. Each crack made us flinch, remembering the hospital's east wing collapse. About halfway to the university, we encountered another group of survivors, 3 adults and 2 children emerging from what had been a convenience store. They were foraging for supplies and were shocked to see other people. The woman, who introduced herself as Lynn, told us they had been living in a basement apartment that still retained some heat from geothermal pipes running nearby. They had ventured out only when their food ran critically low. We shared what little information we had about the hospital and the engineering facility. They decided to try for the university as well, believing their chances would be better there than in their dwindling basement shelter. The children, a boy and girl who appeared to be around 10 and 8, were worryingly thin but seemed to have adapted to the cold better than the adults. Our expanded group continued the journey together. Progress was painfully slow. What would have been a 20-minute drive in normal conditions took us over 4 hours to walk. The children tired quickly, and we took turns carrying them. The respiratory therapist, Miguel, developed early signs of frostbite on his face despite our precautions. We applied chemical heat packs from our medical supplies, but knew they were only a temporary measure. As we approached the Boyce River, which we needed to cross to reach the university, we faced a new challenge. The river had frozen solid enough to walk on, but the approach was treacherous, a steep embankment covered in ice. Dr. Mendez slipped while descending and slid all the way to the river's surface. We heard the crack of bone as he landed, followed by his cry of pain. His leg was broken, a compound fracture with the bone protruding through his pants. There on the frozen river, I performed emergency first aid. We had a limited supply of pain medication, which I administered, while the others created a makeshift splint from materials in our packs. Dr. Patel, though trained as an emergency physician, vomited at the sight of her colleague's injury, a sign of how depleted and stressed we all were. We fashioned a sled from the plastic backboard we'd brought, placing Dr. Mendez on it and taking turns pulling it across the river and up the opposite bank. The university was visible now, its distinctive blue glass business building reflecting what little light penetrated the heavy cloud cover. The engineering building was beyond it, deeper into campus. Just as we approached the edge of campus, we spotted movement. Figures in the same insulation suit outfits we'd seen the engineers wearing were approaching us. They'd have been watching for our arrival. Having quickly assessed our condition, gave us warm drinks from insulated containers, and helped transport Dr. Mendez and the children to their shelter. The engineering building looked unremarkable from outside, just another academic building buried in snow. But inside was a revelation. The temperature was a comfortable 65 degrees. Electric lights, dim to conserve power but steadily glowing, illuminated spaces that had been completely reorganized for survival. The large open atrium at the center of the building had been converted into a communal living and eating area. Classrooms served as sleeping quarters, laboratories as workshops, and food preparation areas. Dr. Lancaster, the engineering professor who had led the delegation to our hospital, greeted us warmly. "We were beginning to worry you wouldn't make it," he said. "The temperature dropped another 5 degrees last night." He explained their situation as we were given hot food, a simple but flavorful stew made from stored grains and dried vegetables. Their community consisted of 48 people, faculty, students, and some family members who had been on campus when the crisis began. They had been preparing for nearly a week before the first blizzard hit, having taken the scientific warnings more seriously than most. Their preparations weren't perfect, but they were methodical and forward-thinking. The engineering students had converted the building's walk-in freezer into the warmest room in the facility, a stroke of genius given that the freezer was already perfectly insulated, just designed to keep cold in rather than out. They had reversed its function, making it a heat repository. Inside they were growing mushrooms and teaching themselves to make candles from animal fat, rendered from the limited meat they had salvaged before it spoiled. Dr. Lancaster had established a system based on expertise rather than traditional hierarchy. Decisions were made by those most qualified in a particular area, with conflicts resolved by a small council elected by the community. It was a stark contrast to the hospital's increasingly dysfunctional command structure. As medical professionals, we were immediately incorporated into their organization. Dr. Mendez was treated in their makeshift medical bay, where a veterinary student with orthopedic experience reset his leg under Dr. Patel's supervision. The children from the basement apartment were examined, diagnosed with mild malnutrition, but otherwise healthy, and reunited with their parents who were given quarters near the central atrium. That first night in the engineering building, I slept on a camping mattress in a former computer lab now serving as a women's dormitory. Despite the hard floor and unfamiliar surroundings, it was the most restful sleep I'd had since the crisis began. The simple knowledge that the building was warm, secure, and managed by competent people lifted an enormous weight from my shoulders. Of course, my thoughts returned to those we'd left behind at the hospital. I wondered if they would interpret our departure as betrayal rather than a desperate attempt to find help. I wondered how many would still be alive if, and when we could send assistance. The guilt was heavy, but so was the relief of finding a place where survival seemed possible rather than merely delayed. Morning brought new challenges and opportunities. The engineers were eager to learn about the medical situations we'd faced, particularly frost lung. They had experienced some respiratory issues among their population, but nothing as severe as what we'd seen at the hospital. Dr. Patel hypothesized that their better environmental controls, less humidity, more consistent temperature, might be inhibiting the fungal growth. They, in turn, shared their innovations with us. An anthropology professor had been teaching them how to make proper snow shelters and cold weather clothing from materials they'd never considered. Indigenous peoples solved these problems centuries ago, she explained during a morning briefing. We just need to set aside our modern arrogance and learn. The engineering students demonstrated their modified solar panels, designed to capture and magnify the reduced sunlight. They had positioned them to catch the maximum possible light during the brief periods when the cloud cover thinned slightly. The energy was stored in battery banks salvaged from electric vehicles abandoned nearby. It wasn't enough for luxury, but it maintained essential systems and some lighting. Their food situation was better than the hospital's but still precarious. They had a 3-month supply at current consumption rates, carefully inventoried and rationed. They were experimenting with growing certain plants under artificial light and had even begun cultivating insect protein. Mealworms in plastic bins, harvested and ground into a flour-like substance that was added to their bread and stews. When they described this to us, Miguel, our respiratory therapist, turned slightly green but didn't complain. Hunger is an effective cure for squeamishness. That day, our medical team met with the engineers to develop a plan for the hospital. We couldn't abandon the people we left behind, but rushing back without proper preparation would only result in more casualties. Dr. Lancaster showed us detailed thermal maps of the city, created using drones equipped with infrared sensors. The hospital's heat signature was already diminishing, confirming our fears about the failing systems. We need to organize an extraction, I said, pointing to the hospital on their map. There are still over 200 people there, many of them patients who can't travel without assistance. The logistics were daunting. We would need transportation capable of handling the snow-covered streets, medical supplies for transfer of critical patients, and additional shelter space once they arrived. The engineering building was already at capacity. We would need to secure and prepare additional campus buildings, a task that would require significant manpower and resources. A mechanical engineering professor named Dr. Alvarez had a potential solution for transportation. Before the blizzard, we were working on autonomous snow-clearing vehicles, he explained. We have 2 prototypes in the workshop that could be modified to transport people. They're designed to handle extreme conditions. The next few days were consumed with preparations. I worked with Dr. Patel to create medical evacuation protocols while the engineering team modified their vehicles. Others began securing neighboring buildings, setting up heating systems using the same principles they'd applied to the engineering facility. The work was exhausting but purposeful. For the first time since the blizzard hit, I felt like we were getting ahead of the crisis rather than merely reacting to it. On day 28, as we were finalizing the evacuation plan, something unexpected happened. The anthropology professor, Dr. Collins, had modified a ham radio to operate on multiple frequencies. She maintained a listening schedule, hoping to contact other survivors. That afternoon, she picked up a transmission, broken and static-filled, but clearly human in origin. The radio operator was a 19-year-old engineering student named Elliot who had built the equipment from salvaged parts. He had been scanning frequencies systematically for days. When we heard the first crackle of another human voice, everyone in the room fell silent. It was a group in Salt Lake City, approximately 340 miles away. They had established a survival community in a convention center with access to a natural gas well that was still functioning. They reported temperatures slightly warmer than ours but still far below freezing. Then another signal came through, this one from a rural commune in Wyoming. They had been better prepared than most, with food stores and alternative energy sources already in place before the crisis. They reported livestock losses, but had managed to save some animals by bringing them inside their main living structures. These contacts changed our perspective dramatically. We weren't alone. There were other organized groups of survivors out there, each with different resources and information. Over the next hours, Iliad established a rudimentary communication network, agreeing on scheduled transmission times to conserve power while maintaining contact. The most valuable information came from a weather station in Montana that had somehow maintained operations. They confirmed what we had begun to suspect. This wasn't a temporary weather anomaly, but an actual climatic shift. The volcanic activity had ejected massive amounts of particulate matter into the upper atmosphere, blocking solar radiation and triggering a rapid cooling effect. Their instruments showed no sign of the particulate matter dispersing. In fact, it appeared to be spreading, creating a self-reinforcing cooling cycle. This information was sobering, but it also helped us plan more effectively. We were no longer waiting for things to return to normal. This was the new normal, at least for the foreseeable future. We needed long-term solutions, not temporary measures. The most promising contact came late on day 29. A community in northern New Mexico reported significantly milder conditions, still colder than their historical norms but manageable. More importantly, they had access to geothermal energy from hot springs in the area. They were using this resource to heat greenhouses where they were successfully growing crops. Real food, not just stored supplies or improvised alternatives. Their transmission caused a stir among our community. The prospect of fresh vegetables of sustainable food production was powerfully appealing after weeks of ration-preserved foods, and the warmer temperatures would reduce the constant struggle against the cold that dominated our existence. Could we make it there? People began asking. How far is it? Could we travel that distance in these conditions? The questions were valid, but our immediate concern had to be the hospital evacuation. We couldn't consider a longer journey until we had addressed the more urgent crisis closer to home. The extraction plan was set for day 30. The modified snow vehicles were ready, and teams had been organized to handle different aspects of the evacuation. Medical personnel would assess and stabilize patients for transport. Engineering students would secure critical supplies. A security team, led by a former military student, would maintain order and assist with the physical movement of people. The night before the operation, I couldn't sleep. My mind cycled through everything that could go wrong. What if the hospital had completely lost heat and everyone was already dead? What if Barbara Winters and the administration refused our help out of pride or anger? What if the National Guard had abandoned their post, leaving the facility vulnerable to desperate outsiders? What if the snow vehicles couldn't handle the conditions? Morning came with no answers, only the necessity of action. Our team assembled in the engineering building's atrium. 10 of us would go on the initial mission, 3 medical staff including myself, 4 engineers to operate the vehicles, and 3 security personnel. We were dressed in insulated clothing designed by the anthropology department, layered for maximum protection against the cold. The snow vehicles looked like something from a science fiction film. Boxy, utilitarian machines with treads instead of wheels and reinforced plexiglass windows. Each could carry about 15 people in addition to the driver, though the space would be cramped. We loaded emergency medical supplies, extra insulation blankets, and high-calorie food rations for those we hoped to rescue. We set out at first light, though the distinction between day and night had become increasingly subtle under the perpetual cloud cover. The vehicles performed better than I had expected, cutting through the snow with impressive efficiency. The journey that had taken us over 4 hours on foot was covered in less than 1 hour by the snow vehicles. As we approached the hospital, I felt my chest tighten with anxiety. From a distance, the building looked intact except for the collapsed east wing, but there were no lights visible in the windows. The National Guard perimeter was still in place, though the number of soldiers visible had decreased significantly. The young lieutenant I had spoken with before our departure recognized me as we approached the checkpoint. His face was gaunt, his eyes deeply shadowed from exhaustion. "You came back," he said simply, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "We brought transportation," I replied. We can evacuate people to a secure location with stable heat and power. He didn't ask questions about our destination or the plan. He simply radioed his commanding officer and directed us to the main entrance while we waited for authorization to proceed. The hospital interior was shockingly cold, far worse than when we had left. My breath formed thick clouds in front of my face, and frost coated every surface. The main lobby, which had been a bustling triage area, was nearly deserted. A few people huddled under blankets looked up as we entered, their expressions first fearful, then hopeful, as they recognized familiar faces. "Where is everyone?" Dr. Patel asked one of the security guards we recognized. "Central cafeteria," he replied through chattering teeth. "Only place with any heat left. They've been burning furniture for 3 days." We hurried through darkened corridors to the cafeteria. The scene that greeted us was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Nearly 200 people were crowded into a space designed for perhaps half that number. They had created a circle around several makeshift fire barrels where wooden chairs, desks, and even some door frames were being burned to generate heat. The smoke was vented through an improvised chimney made from air conditioning ducts. Barbara Winters was there organizing the distribution of what appeared to be the last of the food supplies. She froze when she saw us, emotions warring on her face, relief, anger, suspicion. I approached her directly. "We have transportation and a secure location with sustainable heat and power," I said, keeping my voice steady. "We can evacuate everyone, but we need to move quickly." She stared at me for a long moment before responding. "You left us." "We left to find help," I corrected gently, "and we found it. Now we're back, just like we promised." Her resistance crumbled visibly. "We lost 37 people since you left. The cold, the fungal infection, lack of medical supplies." Her voice broke. "I did everything I could." "I know you did," I assured her. "And now we need to save those who are left." The evacuation began immediately. We prioritized the most vulnerable patients, moving them carefully to the snow vehicles. The engineers had brought portable heating units that helped stabilize patients during the transfer process. Each trip could take only about 30 people between the two vehicles, meaning we would need multiple journeys to evacuate everyone. Dr. Patel remained at the hospital to oversee patient preparation, while I accompanied the first group back to campus. The relief on people's faces as they entered the warm engineering building was profound. Many wept openly. The community had prepared hot drinks and soup for the new arrivals, and the medical team we had established at the university immediately began assessing those in need of treatment. The evacuation continued throughout the day and into the night. With each trip, the hospital group grew weaker. The final group included Barbara Winters and the remaining administrative staff, who had insisted on being the last to leave. By the time the operation was complete, we had evacuated 189 survivors from the hospital. Many were in critical condition from exposure, malnutrition, or frost lung, but they were alive and now had a fighting chance. Integrating such a large number of new people into our existing community created significant challenges. The additional campus buildings we had prepared helped with housing, but resources were stretched then. Food rations had to be reduced. Water usage was strictly controlled. Privacy became virtually non-existent as people shared crowded spaces. Yet despite these hardships, morale improved. The hospital survivors brought valuable skills and perspectives to the community. Their gratitude created a positive atmosphere that counterbalanced the physical discomforts. And most importantly, the success of the evacuation mission gave everyone hope that organized, effective action was possible even in our dire circumstances. Day 31 brought another radio communication that would shape our future plans. The New Mexico community provided more detailed information about their situation. They had established their settlement near a series of hot springs with significant geothermal activity. The natural heat had allowed them to create large greenhouse structures where they were growing a variety of crops: beans, potatoes, hardy greens, and even some fruits. More importantly, they extended an invitation. "We have capacity for more people," their spokesperson said, "especially those with medical or agricultural knowledge. The journey will be difficult, but for those who can make it, there's a place here." The distance was daunting, over 800 miles through terrain that would be covered in snow and ice. Under normal conditions, it would be a 14-hour drive. In our current reality, it could take weeks, with significant dangers along the way. Yet the prospect of reaching a location with sustainable food production and milder temperatures was powerfully attractive. That evening, our Community Leadership Council convened to discuss the possibility. The debate was intense. Some argued we had established a viable shelter and should focus on improving our current situation, rather than risking a dangerous journey. Others believed that long-term survival would be impossible in Idaho's extreme conditions, and that moving south was our only hope. Dr. Lancaster presented a compromise. "We don't all have to go," he said. "We could send an expedition, our strongest members with essential skills. If they succeed, they can either return for others or help establish a supply line between the two communities." This approach gained traction. A voluntary expedition would allow those unwilling or unable to make the journey to remain in our relatively secure campus settlement, while creating the possibility of a better future for everyone. I found myself volunteering immediately. As one of the few medical professionals with emergency and trauma experience, I felt my skills would be valuable on such a journey. And something in me needed to keep moving, to take action rather than merely survive in place. 9 others joined me, 2 engineers familiar with the snow vehicles, a radio operator to maintain communication, an anthropology student with wilderness survival training, a former military person for security, 2 agricultural experts who had been faculty in the university's extension program, and 2 others chosen for their physical strength and endurance. We spent the next 2 days preparing. Maps were studied and routes planned, avoiding major cities where possible in favor of rural areas where we might find supplies with less competition from other survivors. The snow vehicles were serviced and modified for the longer journey, with additional fuel capacity and enhanced heating systems. Food supplies were calculated carefully. We would take only what was necessary for the journey, leaving as much as possible for those remaining behind. The most difficult preparations were personal, saying goodbye to people we had come to care about, not knowing if we would ever see them again. On the morning of our departure, day 34 since the first blizzard, the entire community gathered to see us off. Even those who had argued against the expedition wished us well. Dr. Patel hugged me tightly. "Find us a warm place to grow old," she whispered. Our journey began with cautious optimism. The snow vehicles performed well on Boise buried streets, and we made good progress toward the interstate that would lead us south. The highway itself was indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape, completely covered in snow, but the engineers had GPS units that still functioned, allowing us to follow the route even without visible markers. The first day passed without major incident. We covered approximately 50 miles before stopping to make camp for the night. The vehicles provided shelter, and we used small propane heaters carefully monitored to prevent carbon monoxide buildup. The temperature outside was nearly 60 below zero, making any activity exposed to the elements extremely dangerous. Day 2 brought our first significant challenge. As we approached what had been the small town of Mountain Home, we encountered a roadblock. A group of about 20 people had established a checkpoint on the highway, demanding passage fees from anyone wanting to continue south. They were armed with hunting rifles and had spotters positioned on nearby elevated positions. Our security lead, a former Army Ranger named Jackson, assessed the situation quickly. "They're organized but desperate," he said quietly. "Look at how thin they are, how they're dressed. They're barely surviving." We discussed our options. Attempting to bypass the roadblock could lead to a confrontation we couldn't afford. Turning back would mean abandoning our mission. Negotiation seemed our best choice, though we had little to offer that wouldn't compromise our own journey. Jackson and I approached the checkpoint, while the others remained with the vehicles, engines running in case a quick departure became necessary. The leader of the roadblock group was a middle-aged woman with a weathered face and calculating eyes. She introduced herself simply as Marla. "We control this section of road," she stated flatly. "Passage requires contribution to our community." "We don't have supplies to spare," I replied honestly. "We're on a long-distance journey to locate a sustainable settlement." Her expression didn't change. Everyone's looking for something better. Meanwhile, my people are starving here and now. We reached a compromise after tense negotiation. We had medical supplies and knowledge they lacked. I spent 2 hours treating their sick and injured, frostbite, respiratory infections, malnutrition, while sharing information about frost lung prevention. In exchange, they provided information about conditions further south and allowed us passage without taking our critical supplies. As we prepared to continue our journey, Marla approached me privately. "If you find this paradise you're looking for," she said, "come back for those who deserve a chance. There are good people here, just trying to survive." I promised I would remember them, though we both knew the likelihood of my return was slim at best. The encounter left me troubled. How many similar groups existed across the country? How many desperate communities were forming, each with their own rules and methods of survival. We'd have been fortunate that Marla's group was relatively reasonable. Others might not be. Our progress slowed as we continued south. The interstate became increasingly difficult to navigate, with abandoned vehicles buried under snow creating obstacles that our vehicles had to circumvent. We passed through several small towns, all apparently deserted, though we occasionally saw smoke rising from isolated buildings, indicating that some had chosen to shelter in place. On the 5th day of our journey, a severe storm forced us to stop completely. The wind was so powerful it rocked our vehicles despite their substantial weight, and visibility dropped to zero in the blowing snow. We hunkered down for nearly 24 hours, conserving fuel by running the engines only intermittently to maintain survivable temperatures inside. During that long night, Elliot, our radio operator, picked up a faint transmission from another group of travelers heading south from Wyoming. They too had heard about the New Mexico settlement and were attempting to reach it. Their situation sounded precarious. They had lost several members of their group to the cold and were running low on supplies. When the storm finally abated, we altered our course slightly to intercept the Wyoming group. We found them the following day, 3 vehicles, conventional 4-wheel drives ill-suited to the conditions, carrying 11 people. Their relief at seeing us was palpable. They had been on the verge of turning back, convinced they couldn't complete the journey alone. We couldn't accommodate all of them in our vehicles, but we shared supplies, information, and encouragement. After consulting maps together, we identified a potential shelter location about 30 miles ahead, a state park visitor center that might provide temporary refuge while they repaired one of their failing vehicles. We agreed to continue in convoy, our better-equipped vehicles breaking trail for their struggling caravan. This pattern continued as we moved south, encountering other survivors, sharing what we could, gathering information about conditions ahead. Some joined our growing convoy temporarily before branching off toward their own destinations. Others chose to follow us all the way to New Mexico, believing in the promise of the settlement there. By day 40 since the original blizzard, our convoy had grown to 5 vehicles carrying 32 people. Our progress was slow but steady, averaging about 30 miles per day when conditions permitted travel. The temperature gradually increased as we moved south, still well below freezing, but no longer the life-threatening extreme cold of Idaho. We crossed into Utah, finding the major cities largely abandoned but signs of organized communities in smaller towns and rural areas. A National Guard outpost near the Nevada border provided our first contact with any remaining government authority. They had limited supplies but shared current intelligence about road conditions and hazard areas we should avoid. Their commanding officer, a tired-looking woman with captain's bars, told us they had received no orders from higher command in over 3 weeks. "We're maintaining our post because there's nowhere else to go," she explained, "and because people still need help when they pass through." She confirmed what we had pieced together from various sources. The federal government had essentially collapsed under the weight of the crisis. Some regional and state authorities were still functioning in limited capacities, but there was no coordinated national response. Communities were on their own, developing localized solutions for survival. The National Guard captain marked potential danger zones on our maps, areas where desperate groups had established territorial control, places where infrastructure had catastrophically failed, creating hazards like ruptured gas lines or collapsed overpasses. She also highlighted a few safe harbors, communities that had organized effectively and were known to offer assistance to travelers. "Avoid Salt Lake City completely," she warned. "The downtown area is a war zone between competing factions. Take the eastern route through the mountains. It's harder terrain but safer from human threats." We followed her advice, detouring through the Wasatch Range rather than taking the more direct interstate route. The mountain passes were treacherous, with snowdrifts taller than our vehicles in some places. The engineers took turns breaking trail, using the vehicle's specialized treads to compact a path through the deepest snow. On our second day in the mountains, we encountered a family living in a ski resort lodge. They had been caretakers when the disaster struck and had wisely decided to remain where they had shelter, fuel, and access to the resort's food supplies. They were cautious at first, watching our approach through binoculars and greeting us with hunting rifles visible, but not pointed directly at us. After establishing our peaceful intentions, they became welcoming hosts, offering us hot meals and a night's shelter in the lodge. In exchange, I examined their young daughter, who had developed a persistent cough. It wasn't frost lung, thankfully just a common respiratory infection exacerbated by the dry, cold air. I left them with antibiotics and instructions for treatment. The family shared valuable information about the routes ahead and conditions further south. They had maintained a functioning hand radio and had regular contact with other isolated communities throughout Utah and Nevada. According to their information, conditions improved noticeably in northern Arizona, where the snowfall was significantly lighter and temperatures occasionally rose above freezing during daylight hours. We continued our journey with renewed determination. The prospect of warmer temperatures fueled our motivation through the difficult mountain terrain. After 5 grueling days in the Wasatch Range, we descended into a valley where the snow cover was noticeably thinner. The temperature had risen to a balmy 15 degrees Fahrenheit, practically tropical compared to what we had endured in Idaho. Our convoy had developed a functional routine. The strongest vehicles led, breaking trail and scouting ahead. The middle vehicles carried most of our supplies and those with medical needs. The rear vehicles maintained communication with those who had fallen behind and kept watch for any threats following us. Each night we established a perimeter around our camp, posting guards in shifts despite the exhaustion everyone felt. The group dynamic was complex. 32 people from various backgrounds, most strangers to each other before the crisis, now depended on each other for survival. Conflicts inevitably arose, disagreements about resource allocation, route planning, leadership decisions. As one of the original expedition members, I often found myself mediating these disputes, drawing on my experience managing emergency room crises to keep tensions from escalating. A woman from the Wyoming group, a former high school principal named Eleanor, emerged as an effective community organizer. She created rotating work schedules, ensuring that essential tasks were distributed fairly while accounting for individual skills and limitations. Her calm, authoritative presence was particularly valuable when fatigue and stress made tempers short. By day 45, we had reached the Utah-Arizona border. The landscape changed dramatically as we descended in elevation. Snow still covered the ground, but in patches rather than the uniform blanket we had grown accustomed to. Bare rock and dormant vegetation were visible, startling in their ordinariness after weeks of seeing nothing but white. We made camp near what had been a highway rest area. As we set up our nightly perimeter, Jackson, our security lead, noticed movement in the distance. Through binoculars, we could see 3 figures watching us from a ridge about half a mile away. They made no attempt to approach or communicate, simply observing our activities before disappearing as darkness fell. "Could be scouts," Jackson said quietly. "We should double the watch tonight." The night passed without incident, but the sense of being observed persisted. As we continued our journey the following day, we occasionally glimpsed the same 3 figures paralleling our route, always keeping their distance. Their presence was unnerving, but not overtly threatening. They seemed more interested in assessing us than confronting us. On the afternoon of the second day in Arizona, as we stopped to address a mechanical issue with one of the vehicles, the observers finally approached. There were indeed 3 of them: a tall, lean man who appeared to be in his 50s, a younger woman with her hair in tight braids, and a teenage boy who moved with the wariness of someone who had grown up quickly in harsh circumstances. The man introduced himself as Thomas, a former ranger with the National Park Service. His companions were his daughter Nia and her friend Caleb. They had been tracking us since we crossed into Arizona, determining whether we posed a threat to their community. "We have a settlement about 20 miles east of here," Thomas explained, "nearly 100 people. We've managed to establish secure perimeters and sustainable systems. We're careful about who we invite in." I explained our destination, the geothermal settlement in northern New Mexico, and our hope to find more hospitable conditions there. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "We've had radio contact with them. They're legitimate, and they're doing well by all accounts. Better than most in these times, but the route you're taking will bring you through some difficult territory. There's a group controlling the Eastern Passage who aren't as welcoming as we are." Thomas offered an alternative: stay with their community for a few days to rest and resupply, then take a guide who knew the back routes that would bypass the territorial group. The offer was generous, but some in our convoy were suspicious, worried about potential traps or resource theft. After discussing it privately among our leadership council, now consisting of representatives from each of the groups that had joined our journey, we decided to accept Thomas' invitation, but with caution. Half our vehicles and people would go to their settlement. The other half would maintain a secure position at our current location, ready to assist if anything went wrong. I wanted the advance group to the settlement, which turned out to be a former tourist resort near a small lake. The community had developed impressive adaptations to the new climate reality. They had insulated their buildings extensively, created a water filtration system using the lake as their source, and even managed to construct rudimentary greenhouses where they grew hardy vegetables despite the reduced sunlight. Their leader was a former emergency management director for the county, a woman named Sophia, who had implemented disaster preparedness plans before the government collapsed. Her foresight had saved many lives, and her continuing leadership had created one of the more stable communities we had encountered. During our 3-day stay, we exchanged knowledge and resources. Our medical team treated several of their residents, while their mechanics helped repair and improve our vehicles. Their agricultural experts shared techniques for cold weather farming with our own specialists. The community atmosphere was cautiously optimistic. They had survived the worst of the initial crisis and were beginning to plan for a long-term future in the changed world. On the day of our departure, Sophia provided us with detailed maps and a guide named Marcus who knew the terrain intimately. The direct route would take you through garrison territory, she explained, referring to the group Thomas had warned us about. They call themselves it because they've taken over a former military installation. They demand heavy tribute from travelers, have their supplies at minimum, and sometimes conscript able-bodied people into their workforce. Marcus will take you around their patrol routes. Marcus proved to be an invaluable guide. His knowledge of the backcountry allowed us to make good progress while avoiding main roads and potential confrontations. He was a former wilderness guide who had been leading backcountry trips when the blizzards began. His survival skills had kept him alive until he found Sophia's community. The world's different now, he told me as we navigated a particularly challenging section of terrain. But the land is still the land. It doesn't care about our human disasters. It adapts and continues. We need to learn from that. After 4 days of careful navigation through Arizona's transformed landscape, we reached the New Mexico border without encountering the garrison group. Marcus left us there, returning to his community with supplies we had shared as payment for his assistance. The farewell was emotional. In our short time together, bonds had formed that felt surprisingly deep. "You're doing the right thing," he told us as he prepared to depart. "Moving south, finding places where life can be sustainable. That's how humanity will survive this, not by trying to maintain the old ways in places that can no longer support them, but by adapting, migrating, evolving with the changed conditions." His words stayed with me as we continued our journey, now less than 200 miles from our destination. The radio operator had made contact with the geothermal settlement, confirming they were expecting us and would send guides to meet us at a designated location once we were closer. The terrain in northern New Mexico was challenging but not impassable. Snow cover was intermittent, and daytime temperatures occasionally rose above freezing, a remarkable change from the deep freeze we had left behind in Idaho. We could sometimes remove our outer layers during the day, feeling sunlight on our faces that actually carried some warmth. On day 54, since the first blizzard, we encountered another weather front moving through. Unlike the killer storms of the north, this was merely uncomfortable rather than life-threatening. Still, we decided to shelter in place for a day in an abandoned truck stop that provided solid protection from the elements. While the others focused on vehicle maintenance and rest, I took inventory of our medical supplies and the health status of our group. The journey had taken its toll. Everyone had lost weight despite our efforts to maintain adequate nutrition. Several people showed signs of vitamin deficiencies, particularly vitamin D from lack of sunlight. Frostbite scars were common, and many suffered from persistent coughs due to the constant cold air irritating their lungs. Yet there were positive signs as well. No one had developed frost lung since we left Idaho. The psychological improvements were even more noticeable. People who had been nearly catatonic with despair in the early days of the crisis were now engaged and forward-looking. They made plans, developed skills, formed relationships. The human capacity for adaptation was proving as reliable as Marcus had suggested. That evening, as we gathered in what had been the truck stop restaurant, Eleanor organized an impromptu talent show. It seemed absurd at first, a frivolous activity amid our desperate circumstances. But as people shared songs, stories, and even a few comedy routines, I realized how essential it was. This wasn't just entertainment. It was reclaiming our humanity from the pure survival mode we had been operating in. A young man who had joined us from a stranded bus in Utah played a harmonica he had carried in his pocket. A former teacher recited poetry from memory. Jackson, our usually stoic security lead, surprised everyone with a remarkable singing voice. The evening transformed our group from a collection of survivors into a genuine community. The storm passed overnight, and we continued our journey the following morning. As we moved further south, the changes in the environment became more pronounced. We saw patches of ground where hardy grasses were still green. Birds were more numerous and active. Once we spotted a deer moving through a stand of pine trees, thin but alive, evidence that the ecosystem was adapting rather than completely collapsing. On day 57, we reached the rendezvous point where guides from the geothermal settlement had agreed to meet us. It was a highway intersection marked by a distinctive rock formation. We arrived early afternoon and prepared to wait, establishing a temporary camp with defensive positions out of habit more than necessity. To our surprise, the guides arrived within hours, 4 people on horseback, bundled against the cold but moving with a confidence we hadn't seen in weeks. Their leader, a woman with silver-streaked black hair named Elena, greeted us warmly. "Welcome, travelers. You've come a long way. The settlement is about 15 miles from here, but the terrain is tricky. We'll help you navigate it safely. You should be sleeping in warm beds by tomorrow night." The prospect of warm beds seemed almost mythical after nearly 2 months of makeshift shelters and vehicle seats. Elena's team distributed fresh food to our group: actual bread, dried fruit, and jerky made from local game. The taste of food that hadn't come from a can or packet was overwhelming. Some people wept as they ate. We set out at first light the next morning, our convoy following the horseback guides along routes that weren't visible on any map. The landscape became increasingly volcanic, with strange rock formations and occasional steam vents visible where thermal activity reached the surface. The temperature was noticeably warmer here, hovering just above freezing even in the early morning. By midday, we could see our destination in the distance. The settlement was nestled in a valley between low mountains, with several large greenhouse structures clearly visible even from miles away. Smoke rose from what appeared to be numerous chimneys, and we could make out the movement of people and animals, a functioning community unlike anything we had seen since the crisis began. Elena noticed my expression as I took in the sight. "It's not paradise," she cautioned. "We have our struggles and limitations, but we have heat, food, and a future. That's more than most can claim these days." As we drew closer, more details became apparent. The settlement was a combination of pre-existing structures, a former hot springs resort and conference center, and new construction designed to maximize the geothermal resources. Greenhouses were positioned directly over thermal vents, using the natural heat to create growing environments. Solar panels supplemented the geothermal energy, taking advantage of the clearer skies this far south. The most striking feature was the community itself. People moved with purpose, carrying tools, tending livestock, transporting supplies. Children played in a cleared area, supervised by adults who weren't solely focused on immediate survival. There was organization, intention, and most remarkably, evidence of long-term planning. We were welcomed at the settlement's main entrance by a delegation led by a tall man with a closely trimmed beard who introduced himself as Michael, one of the community's council members. "We've been tracking your progress since you first made radio contact," he said. "Quite an achievement to make it all this way from Idaho. We have accommodations prepared and medical staff ready to assess anyone who needs attention." The next hours were a blur of introductions, orientations, and the overwhelming sensation of being somewhere truly safe for the first time in 2 months. The settlement had established clear protocols for integrating new arrivals: medical screenings to prevent disease introduction, skills assessments to determine optimal work placements, temporary housing assignments while more permanent arrangements were considered. Their medical facility was basic but functional, staffed by 2 doctors and several nurses who had been at a medical conference at the Hot Springs Resort when the crisis began. They had adequate supplies and, crucially, the ability to maintain sterile conditions thanks to their reliable heat and water sources. I almost broke down when they showed me their small but well-organized pharmacy, stocked with medications I hadn't seen since leaving the hospital. That evening, our entire convoy group was invited to a community meal in what had been the resort's main dining hall. About 300 people gathered, including both established settlement members and more recent arrivals. The food was simple but fresh and nutritious: root vegetables grown in the greenhouses, protein from rabbits and chickens raised on site, bread made from stored grain, supplemented with flour ground from alternative sources. Michael introduced our group to the community, highlighting the journey we had undertaken and the diverse skills we brought. He then gave an overview of the settlement's development and current status for our benefit. "We were lucky in many ways," he explained. "This location had inherent advantages with its geothermal resources. The resort had substantial food stocks for its conference business, and we had a fortuitous mix of people with relevant skills, who were either staff or guests when the crisis hit. We've built on those advantages, expanding our capacity and developing systems that should be sustainable long-term. Their greenhouse operation was the heart of the settlement's success. Using geothermal heat, they had created environments where food could grow despite the drastically altered climate. They focused on high-yield, nutritionally dense crops that could thrive in the reduced sunlight conditions: root vegetables, hardy greens, legumes for protein. They had even established a small orchard in the most protected greenhouse, though the fruit trees were still young and not yet producing. The animal husbandry program was equally impressive. They maintained breeding populations of rabbits, chickens, and goats, selected for cold hardiness and efficient feed conversion. A fish farming operation used warm water from the thermal springs to raise tilapia in tanks. The integration of these systems, using animal waste to fertilize crops, crop waste to feed animals, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of sustainable agriculture. Energy management was another area where they had developed effective solutions. The geothermal resources provided base heating for living spaces and greenhouses. Solar panels captured what sunlight was available during the shorter, cloudier days. They had even constructed small wind turbines to harness the stronger air currents that characterized the new weather patterns. As Michael described their systems and future plans, I found myself experiencing a feeling I hadn't fully allowed since the crisis began: hope. Not just the desperate hope of finding the next meal or surviving another night, but genuine hope for a future worth living. This community had moved beyond mere survival to rebuilding, creating a new way of life adapted to the changed world rather than simply trying to endure until things returned to normal. After the community meal, Alina showed our leadership group to a meeting room where the settlement's council wanted to discuss integration options. The council consisted of 7 people, each responsible for different aspects of community operations: agriculture, energy, security, health, education, construction, and external relations. We're not a democracy in the traditional sense, Alina explained. At least not yet. In crisis conditions, we found that expertise-based leadership was more effective. Each council member oversees an area where they have proven knowledge and ability. Major decisions are made collectively by the council, with input from work group leaders. The council's proposal was straightforward. Our group would enter a 3-month integration period. During this time, we would be housed, fed, and included in community activities, while learning the settlement systems and finding our optimal roles. At the end of the period, individuals could choose to become full community members, accepting both the benefits and responsibilities that entailed, or to continue their journey elsewhere with a fair share of supplies. We don't force anyone to stay, Michael emphasized, but we do ask everyone to contribute while they're here. We can't afford passengers in this new world. Those terms seemed more than fair to all of us. After what we had experienced on our journey, the prospect of 3 months in a stable, warm environment with adequate food felt like an unimaginable luxury. The fact that we might find permanent places in this community was almost too much to hope for. That night, I was assigned a small but private room in what had been the resort's staff housing. It had a real bed with clean sheets, a window that didn't leak frigid air, and most remarkably, running water from a tap. I stood under a warm shower for what felt like hours, watching the grime of 2 months on the road swirl down the drain, feeling human again in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. As I lay in bed that night, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From the first patients with hypothermia in July, through the hospital's transformation and collapse, to the desperate evacuation and the long trek south. So many had been lost along the way. So much had been destroyed. Yet here in this valley, warmed by the Earth's core, people have found a way forward. I thought about Dr. Patel and the others we had left behind in Boise. I had promised to find a warm place and then return or send help. Now that I had found it, would I be able to keep that promise? The journey back north would be at least as dangerous as the one south had been, possibly more so as conditions continued to deteriorate. Yet I couldn't abandon those who had trusted me to find a solution. Sleep came slowly that night, despite the comfortable bed and physical exhaustion. My mind was too full of possibilities, plans, and the weight of responsibility I still carried for those left behind. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed not of the ice and snow that had dominated my consciousness for months, but of green plants pushing up through the earth, reaching for whatever sunlight they could find. The first week at the geothermal settlement passed in a blur of orientation sessions, medical examinations, and much-needed rest. Our convoy group stayed mostly together, finding comfort in familiar faces as we adjusted to our new environment. The settlement had established a comprehensive integration process for newcomers, recognizing that the transition from survival mode to community living could be psychologically challenging. Each morning began with a community breakfast in the main dining hall, where work assignments for the day were distributed. In the afternoons, newcomers attended classes about the settlement's systems and history. The evenings were for rest, socialization, and planning sessions for our various subgroups. It was structured without being rigid, organized without feeling controlling. I was assigned to the medical team, working alongside the settlement's existing healthcare providers to assess and treat our convoy members and assist with the general population's needs. The medical facility was housed in what had been the resort's spa building, repurposed with remarkable efficiency. The thermal pools were now used for therapeutic treatments and occasionally for laundry. Treatment rooms had been converted to examination spaces and a small surgical suite. Dr. Rivera, the settlement's chief medical officer, was a family physician who had been attending a medical conference at the resort when the crisis hit. She had quickly established protocols for healthcare delivery with limited resources, prioritizing preventive care and early intervention to avoid more serious conditions that would be difficult to treat. We focus on keeping people healthy rather than fixing them once they're broken, she explained during my orientation. Everyone gets regular checkups. Everyone follows basic preventive measures. We can't afford the luxury of reactive medicine anymore. My emergency medicine background complemented her preventive approach, and we quickly developed a productive working relationship. Many of our convoy members required treatment for conditions developed during our journey: nutritional deficiencies, respiratory issues, frostbite complications, and various injuries that had been inadequately addressed on the road. By the end of that first week, I had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. Wake, eat, work, learn, rest. Simple human activities that had been impossible during the crisis. My body began to recover from the constant stress and deprivation. I slept deeply for the first time in months. I even gained back some of the weight I had lost. Yet even as I adapted to life in the settlement, my thoughts frequently returned to those we had left behind. On the 10th day, I requested a meeting with the community council to discuss the possibility of a rescue mission back to boys. They listened attentively to my proposal but expressed valid concerns about the risks and resource requirements of such an undertaking. "We understand your commitment to your colleagues," Alina said, "but the journey would be even more dangerous now than when you made it. Our latest radio reports indicate conditions continuing to deteriorate northward, and we simply don't have vehicles designed for those conditions." Michael, the settlement's head of external relations, offered an alternative. "We've been working to establish a communication network with other surviving communities. Several have reported successful short-range air transport using light aircraft modified for cold conditions. If we can extend our radio contact to the Boyce area, we might be able to coordinate a sequence of shorter trips that could eventually reach your people." It wasn't an immediate solution, but it was more realistic than my proposal to recreate our original journey in reverse. I agreed to help develop the communication strategy, working with their radio team to extend our range and establish protocols for contact with other settlements. The radio operation was housed in a separate building with its own power supply, considered critical infrastructure by the community leadership. The team had created an impressive array of equipment, much of it modified or hand-built to function in the new climate conditions. Solar panels, wind turbines, and geothermal generators provided redundant power sources to ensure continuous operation. Elliot, the young engineer from our convoy who had established our communication network during the journey, was already deeply involved with the settlement's radio team. His technical skills and innovative thinking had earned him immediate respect among the existing operators. "We're trying to create a map of surviving communities," he explained, showing me a large physical map on the wall, with pins marking confirmed contacts. Each one becomes a node in the network, relaying messages to the next. It's like rebuilding the internet, but with radio waves. Their current range extended about 500 miles in optimal conditions, not quite far enough to reach boys directly. But they had established regular contact with communities in Utah that might be able to extend the network northward. Each day, scheduled transmissions attempted to expand their connections, methodically rebuilding a communication infrastructure for the new world. As I integrated further into the settlement's operations, I began to appreciate the remarkable achievement it represented. This wasn't just a place where people had managed to survive. They were actively building a new society adapted to radically different conditions. The community had begun with about 50 people, resort staff and guests, stranded when the crisis hit, and had grown to over 300 through deliberate expansion and incorporation of compatible groups like ours. The greenhouse system was the heart of their success, providing food security that freed people from the desperate day-to-day survival mentality that dominated most other areas. 5 large structures, each the size of a football field, were positioned directly over geothermal vents. The natural heat created microclimates where plants could thrive despite the altered external conditions. Sophisticated aquaponic systems circulated nutrient-rich water from fish tanks through growing beds, maximizing production while conserving resources. I toured the main greenhouse with Amara, the agricultural director, about 2 weeks after our arrival. The air inside was warm and humid, heavy with the scent of growing things, an almost overwhelming sensory experience after months of frozen sterility. Rows of leafy greens, root vegetables, and even some fruit plants stretched in precise formations. Workers moved carefully between the rows, tending, harvesting, and monitoring the systems. "We're producing about 60% of our current caloric needs," Amara explained. "The rest comes from stored supplies, hunting, and trade with other communities. Our goal is 80% self-sufficiency by the end of the year." The settlement's educational system was equally impressive. Children and teenagers attended structured classes in the morning, while adults participated in skill sharing and specialized training in the afternoons. Everyone was both student and teacher in some capacity, recognizing that knowledge transfer was essential for long-term survival. I began teaching emergency medicine classes twice weekly, sharing techniques for handling common injuries and illnesses with limited resources. In turn, I attended sessions on greenhouse management, basic electrical system maintenance, and the settlement's governance structure. This constant learning environment created a dynamic, adaptable community. 3 weeks after our arrival, we received news that would transform our integration process. The radio team established contact with a community in southern Idaho that had successfully maintained a small airfield. They had 2 functioning lightweight aircraft, modified for cold weather operation. After complex negotiations conducted through multiple relay points, they agreed to attempt a rescue operation to Boise State University, where we had left Dr. Patel and the others. The mission would require careful coordination between multiple settlements, fuel caches established at strategic points, ground teams to provide weather information and emergency landing zones, and precise timing to utilize the limited daylight hours effectively. Planning began immediately, with our detailed knowledge of the Boise situation proving invaluable. I volunteered to return with the rescue team, despite concerns from Dr. Rivera about sending her new assistant back into the dangerous northern zones. "You've only just recovered from your journey," she argued during a private conversation in the medical facility. "Your body needs more time to heal properly." "I made a promise," I replied simply. "They trusted me to find help in return. I can't send strangers in my place." She understood, as I suspected she would. The settlement had a strong ethic of honoring commitments and valuing personal integrity. After extracting a promise that I would follow strict medical protocols during the mission, she helped me prepare a comprehensive supply kit for the journey. The rescue mission launched 1 month after our arrival at the settlement. I traveled by ground to the Idaho airfield with 2 other volunteers from our original convoy who also felt compelled to return for those left behind. The journey took 5 days, moving through increasingly harsh conditions as we headed north. Even with the settlement's better-equipped vehicles and more established routes, the environment remained hostile and dangerous. The airfield community was smaller than our settlement, about 100 people maintaining what had been a regional airport. They had survived by repurposing aviation fuel for heating and transport, utilizing the airport's emergency generators, and converting hangar spaces into insulated living quarters. Their 2 aircraft were Cessna 172s modified with ski landing gear and additional insulation. The pilot assigned to our mission was a former Bush pilot named Travis who had extensive experience flying in Alaska before the crisis. His weather-beaten face creased with concern as he examined the flight plan to Boise. "It's right at the edge of our operational range," he explained. "We'll need perfect conditions and no delays. If anything changes, weather, mechanical issues, problems on the ground, we'll have to abort and return immediately." We waited 3 days for suitable conditions, clear enough visibility, and manageable wind speeds. I spent the time preparing mentally for what we might find in Boise. The last radio contact had reported deteriorating conditions but continued survival. That had been over 2 weeks ago. On the morning of the flight, Travis completed his pre-flight checks with methodical precision, while I loaded medical supplies and emergency rations into every available space in the small aircraft. We would be flying non-stop to a makeshift landing strip the Boys State community had prepared on their campus soccer field. The flight itself was an exercise in controlled fear. The small plane buffeted constantly in the turbulent air currents created by the altered atmospheric conditions. Below us, the landscape was almost unrecognizable, an endless expanse of white broken occasionally by dark patches of forest or the geometric shapes of human settlements. Most roads were completely invisible under snowdrifts, and even major cities appeared as little more than subtle variations in the snowy terrain. As we approached Boise, the devastation became more apparent. Entire sections of the city showed signs of structural collapse. The weight of accumulated snow and ice had proven too much for buildings designed for much milder conditions. The hospital where our journey had begun was clearly visible. Half of the structure had completely collapsed, confirming that our evacuation had been necessary and timely. Travis circled the university campus, looking for the signal fires the community had promised to light when they heard our approach. For several agonizing minutes, we saw nothing, raising the terrifying possibility that no one had survived. Then, just as Travis was preparing to abort the landing attempt, 3 columns of black smoke appeared on the soccer field perimeter. They had heard us after all. The landing was harrowing, a steep descent onto a narrow strip, marked only by shoveled pathways in the snow. Travis executed it flawlessly, bringing us to a stop just short of the makeshift barriers the community had erected. As the propeller spun down, figures emerged from the surrounding buildings, approaching cautiously at first, then running when they recognized me among the arrivals. Dr. Patel reached me first, embracing me with surprising strength. She looked thinner, more weathered, but her eyes still held the same determined intelligence. "You actually came back," she said, her voice thick with emotion. We were starting to lose hope. The Boys State community had survived, though not without losses. Of the nearly 250 people we had left behind, about 180 remained. The cold had claimed some, particularly the elderly and those with pre-existing conditions. Others had been lost to accidents or illness, but the core group had maintained their shelter, rationed their resources, and continued to develop survival strategies. We had less than 2 hours on the ground, the absolute maximum if we wanted enough fuel to return safely. I quickly explained the rescue plan while Travis refueled the aircraft from supplies we had brought. We could take 6 people with us on this first flight, the maximum weight the plane could carry back to the southern Idaho airfield. From there, a sequence of flights and ground transports would eventually bring them to the geothermal settlement. "We'll return for more as weather and resources permit," I promised. "This is just the first trip. Now that we've established the route, others will follow." The decision of who would go first was agonizing. Medical need was the primary criterion, but we also considered technical skills that would be valuable at the settlement and psychological factors, like family units that shouldn't be separated. Dr. Patel insisted on staying until the last group. Her leadership was too important to the remaining community. We loaded our 6 passengers, a hypothermia-weakened teenager and his mother, an engineer with specialized greenhouse knowledge, a pregnant woman in her 2nd trimester, and 2 older men with medical conditions requiring treatments unavailable in Boise. Their combined possessions fit into small backpacks, everything else left behind to ensure we remained under the critical weight limit. The departure was emotional but quick, necessity overriding sentiment. Travis had been monitoring the weather throughout our ground time, and a system was moving in that could trap us if we delayed. We promised to return as soon as possible, leaving behind additional supplies, radio equipment to maintain contact, and renewed hope for those remaining. The return flight was even more tense than the outbound journey. The additional weight meant the aircraft performed sluggishly, and the weather deteriorated more rapidly than forecast. Travis maintained his focus with professional intensity, making minute adjustments to our course and altitude to compensate for the challenging conditions. We landed at the southern Idaho airfield just as visibility dropped below safe operational minimums. Had we been 15 minutes later, landing would have been impossible. Our passengers were immediately taken to the community's medical facility for assessment, while Travis and I debriefed the airfield's operations team on conditions in Boise and the viability of future rescue flights. The next 3 days were spent coordinating the ground transport that would take our rescued Boise survivors to the geothermal settlement. I traveled with them, providing medical monitoring during the journey and helping them process the dramatic transition they were experiencing. After months of extreme deprivation and constant struggle for survival, the relatively comfortable conditions of our transport vehicles seemed almost unreal to them. When we finally arrived at the settlement, The community welcomed the new arrivals with compassion and practical support. Unlike our larger convoy, this small group was easily absorbed into existing housing and support systems. The settlement had been preparing for their arrival, with medical treatment plans, living quarters, and integration schedules already established. Over the following weeks, the rescue operation continued whenever weather conditions permitted. Small groups were evacuated from buoys in a carefully planned sequence, each bringing additional members of the university community to safety. The process was slow and fraught with challenges, but by the end of the second month, nearly 100 people had been successfully relocated. Dr. Patel arrived with the third group, bringing comprehensive records of the boys' community's experiences and innovations. Her medical expertise was immediately valuable to the settlement, particularly her experience with frost lung and other conditions specific to the new climate reality. She and Dr. Rivera quickly developed a collaborative relationship, combining their knowledge to address the unique health challenges facing the community. As winter deepened even further, the rescue flights became impossible to sustain. The remaining boy survivors, about 60 people, would have to wait until conditions improved marginally in what would pass for spring in the new climate patterns. The settlement maintained radio contact with them, providing guidance and support remotely while preparing for their eventual evacuation. My role in the community evolved as the immediate rescue operations concluded. With more medical staff now available, I shifted part of my focus to training and documentation. The settlement leaders recognized the importance of preserving knowledge and ensuring skills could be transferred to future generations. I began compiling a comprehensive medical manual adapted to our new conditions, integrating conventional treatments with innovations developed during the crisis. Life developed a rhythm that felt almost normal at times. Work, meals, community gatherings, learning sessions. The structure provided stability that had been entirely absent during the crisis phase. People formed relationships, planned for future seasons, and even occasionally celebrated milestones and achievements. Children played and studied. Gardens grew. The fundamental human drive to build community reasserted itself. 4 months after our arrival at the settlement, Alina asked me to join a council meeting to discuss long-term planning. The settlement had grown to nearly 400 people with the boys' epicues and other smaller groups that had found their way to us. Resources were stretched but still sufficient, particularly as the greenhouse systems expanded and matured. "We're at a turning point," Michael explained during the meeting. "We've moved beyond immediate survival to stability. Now we need to think about real sustainability and growth." The council had been developing a 5-year plan that addressed food production, energy systems, education, healthcare, and governance evolution. They wanted my input on the medical components and my perspective as someone who had witnessed both catastrophic failure and successful adaptation in different communities. "The world has changed permanently," Alina said. "Even if the particulate matter eventually clears from the upper atmosphere, which could take decades, the climate shift has created self-reinforcing cycles. The ice sheets reflect sunlight, cooling the planet further. Methane released from thawing permafrost accelerates the process. We're not going back to the world we knew." The Council's plan acknowledged this reality without surrendering to despair. Instead, it focused on adaptation and rebuilding within new parameters. Expanded greenhouse systems using geothermal energy. Wind and solar power installations designed for reduced sunlight conditions. Educational programs that combined pre-crisis knowledge with new survival skills. Healthcare that emphasized prevention and efficient resource utilization. Most significantly, the plan included outreach to other surviving communities to build a network of cooperation and trade. The settlement had already established regular contact with 11 other stable groups across the Southwest. Each had different resources, challenges, and areas of expertise. Together they were forming the nucleus of a new regional society. After the meeting, I walked through the main greenhouse with Alina, discussing how the medical facility might coordinate more closely with the food production systems. The warm, humid air filled with the scent of growing things still felt miraculous after the frozen wasteland we had traversed. "Do you think we'll make it?" I asked her, watching settlement members carefully tending rows of plants. "As a species, I mean. This isn't just a localized disaster, it's global climate collapse." Alina considered the question seriously before answering. "Humans are remarkably adaptable," she said finally. "We've survived ice ages before, though not with our current population levels or resource dependencies. Some regions will become completely uninhabitable. Others, like this one, have features that make adaptation possible. I think humanity will survive, but in a very different form than before. She gestured toward a small section of the greenhouse where children were receiving a lesson about plant cultivation. That's why documentation and education are so crucial now. We need to preserve essential knowledge while developing new understanding appropriate to changed conditions. Those children will grow up in a world we barely recognize, but they'll see it as normal. 5 months to the day after the first blizzard hit boys, I helped deliver a baby in the settlement's medical facility. The mother was one of our convoy members who had been in early pregnancy during our journey south, a fact she had kept private until reaching safety. The delivery proceeded without complications, a healthy girl with strong lungs and perfect fingers and toes. The community celebrated the birth with a special meal and a naming ceremony drawn from traditions several members had contributed to our evolving culture. The parents named her Phoenix, a choice that resonated deeply with everyone present. From the ashes of our collapsed civilization, new life was emerging. As I held the newborn briefly during the ceremony, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. From the first hypothermia patients in July, through the hospital's transformation and collapse, to our desperate trek south and the establishment of a new community. So much had been lost: people, knowledge, infrastructure, entire ways of life. Yet here was undeniable evidence of continuity and hope. If this child could survive her first breath in our frozen world, maybe humanity did have a chance after all. Not to restore what was lost, but to build something new adapted to the changed conditions. The Ice Age had come again, as it had before in Earth's long history. And once again, human ingenuity, cooperation, and determination were finding ways to endure. The settlement wasn't perfect. Resources remained limited, the future uncertain, and dangers abundant. But we had moved beyond mere survival to something resembling a life worth living. We had community, purpose, and increasingly, hope. In the face of apocalyptic climate change, we had refused to simply perish. Instead, we were adapting, learning, and building a future that none of us could have imagined in the world before the ice. As Phoenix's tiny fingers gripped my own, I made a silent promise, not just to this child, but to all of us who had survived this far. We would preserve what knowledge we could. We would develop new understanding appropriate to our changed world. We would build communities based on cooperation rather than competition. And somehow, against all odds, we would ensure that humanity continued, even in a world transformed by ice.